6,000 years ago, in the ancient trading world of Anatolia, the vast, geographically central landmass that forms the heart of modern Turkey, a person was completing a transaction, a jar of oil perhaps, a bag of grain, a bundle of textiles, whatever it was, it needed to be sealed. It needed to be authenticated. It needed to carry something that said, "This belongs to me. It left my hands." In this condition, and anyone who tampers with it will answer for it. So they pressed a stamp seal into a small lump of clay and bound it around the cord that held the container closed or the document folded. The impression sank into the soft material with the exact pressure of their hand, the exact angle of their wrist, the exact friction of their fingertip against wet clay at a specific moment on a specific afternoon in a specific trading settlement that we are only now beginning to understand. And in the clay, alongside the geometric or animal design of their personal seal, the ridges of their fingerprint preserved themselves, not as art, not intentionally, simply as the physical consequence of a hand pressing wet clay into an intended shape. Then the clay dried. Then the years passed, then the centuries, then the millennia, then the settlement was abandoned and covered by sediment and forgotten by every civilization that rose and fell above it. And then, in 2026, 4,000 or 8,000 or 6,000 years later, depending on which site you're standing above, an archaeologist's brush moved across that clay in a way it had not been moved. Across since the day it was shaped and the ridges appeared. A fingerprint. Specific, unrepeatable. Belonging to exactly one person in all of human history. A person who carried goods along trade routes that predated every civilization we teach in school. A person who knew that their seal was their word and their word was their bond. And the clay was the record that kept both honest. What is happening in Turkey right now, across multiple sites, across multiple time periods, through multiple excavations operating simultaneously, is one of the most significant runs of archaeological discovery in the history of the ancient Near East. And the fingerprints are only the beginning. To understand why a fingerprint preserved on ancient clay carries the weight it carries, you first have to understand what clay seals actually were in the ancient world and what problem they were invented to solve. Because they were not decorative. They were not symbolic in the way that later religious seals and royal emblems would become. In their original form, emerging from the trading communities of Mesopotamia and Anatolia around the 5th and 4th millennia, BCE, clay seals were a technology. A practical, functional, brilliantly designed solution to one of the oldest problems in human economic life. The problem is this: how do you know that what you received is what was sent? When the first long-distance trading networks began to connect the settlements of the ancient Near East, when obsidian from the volcanic highlands of central Anatolia began reaching communities 300 kilometers away on the Mediterranean coast, when copper from the mines of the Taurus Mountains began moving south into Mesopotamia, when grain surpluses from river valley communities began flowing toward the timber-rich but agriculturally limited mountain settlements to the north, the physical act of transporting goods created an immediate vulnerability. The jar that left the sender's hands might not be the jar that arrived. Its contents might have been tampered with, partially emptied, substituted, or stolen entirely. The goods might arrive intact, but the accompanying record of their quantity and quality might have been altered. In a world without paper, without writing, without the legal infrastructure of contracts and courts that modern commerce takes for granted, there was no mechanism to verify authenticity, no way to prove that the sender and receiver were dealing with the same object in the same condition across the same distance. Clay seals, and specifically the system of sealed clay bullae, small hollow clay spheres containing token representations of traded goods, were the ancient world's answer to that problem. A bulla was a sphere-shaped clay object, hollow inside, used to carry clay tokens that represented the terms of a commercial trade. When a transaction was agreed, the tokens representing the goods were placed inside the bulla and the sphere was sealed closed. Both parties could press their respective seals into the exterior surface of the sealed bulla. Then the bulla was dried over fire or in sunlight until it hardened. After that, the only way to access the tokens inside, the only way to discover what the original agreement said, was to break the sphere. Any tampering would be immediately visible. Any attempt to alter the record required destroying the very seal that authenticated it. Think about what this actually solved. In a world without banks, without notaries, without any central authority capable of enforcing a handshake deal between a farmer in one village and a trader passing through from another, two strangers needed a way to make an agreement that neither of them could quietly rewrite later. A spoken promise left no trace. A scratch on a wall could be altered. But a sealed, fired clay sphere containing physical tokens that matched an agreed quantity of goods, that was something else entirely. It turned trust into an object. Break the bulla and you expose the truth, but you also destroyed the seal that proved the truth was authentic, so nobody could crack it open, swap the tokens, and reseal it without leaving evidence. It was, in effect, a tamper-proof contract sealed in the least reversible medium available, fired earth. This system, which archaeologists trace back to the ancient Near East emerging around the 4th millennium BCE, is often described as one of the direct precursors to writing. Excavations at sites across Mesopotamia, Uruk, Susa, and dozens of Laithur, smaller trading settlements along the Tigris and Euphrates, have turned up thousands of these bullae, many still containing their original tokens, undisturbed for over 5,000 years. The tokens inside the bullae were representations of quantities, 4 notches for 400 bags of grain, a small clay cone for a jar of oil. When someone realized that the impressions of those tokens on the outside of the bulla carried the same information as the tokens inside, the bulla became redundant. You could impress the record on a flat clay surface directly, read it from the outside without breaking anything, and have a permanent, authenticated, tamper-evident record of a transaction. That realization, that pressed marks on flat clay could encode information, was one of the conceptual leaps that produced cuneiform writing. But before cuneiform, before writing, before the full administrative apparatus of Mesopotamian civilization emerged, there were seals, personal seals, pressed into clay, marking ownership and identity with the same finality that a signature has today. And in the ancient settlements of Anatolia, they were everywhere. The site at Ulukak Mound in the Iğım, Kemalpasa district of Izmir province in western Turkey, is one of the oldest settlements in the Aegean region, its earliest occupation layers dating back approximately 8,150 years. British archaeologist David French discovered the site in the 1960s, but it remained inadequately explored for decades until systematic excavations began in the mid-1990s, and Professor Özlem Çevik of Trakya University took over the excavation directorship in 2009. What her team has been uncovering there over the past decade and a half has been reshaping the understanding of how early human communities organized their economic and productive lives. In 2022, Çevik's team announced a discovery that drew international attention. They had found the oldest ceramic production workshop ever identified anywhere in the world, dating to between 6,000 and 5,840 BCE. A 6-room building complex containing kilns for firing pottery, groundstones used to grind hematite paint for decorating ceramic vessels, unfinished pottery in various stages of production, pigments, and tools. It was not a household space where someone made pots between other domestic tasks. It was a dedicated, specialized production facility. The first clear physical evidence that ceramic production had separated from domestic life and become something that required its own dedicated space, its own tools, its own trained personnel, its own organizational infrastructure. And inside that workshop, on the clay loaves prepared for pottery making, and the raw material that craftspeople worked with their hands before shaping it into vessels, there were fingerprints, not 1 or 2, multiple, belonging to different people. And when Çevik's team analyzed the ridge patterns preserved in the fired clay, what they found was not a workshop staffed by a single specialist. The fingerprints belonged to male and female adults, and to children as young as 11 years old. A community of producers working together in a dedicated space, leaving the literal biological record of their individual hands pressed into material that would outlast every other trace of their existence by 8,000 years. Çevik was direct about the significance of what the fingerprints showed about gender and labor in this early community. The case of Ulukak suggests that no gender differentiation has been evidenced during the initial steps for specialized pottery production, she said. Women, men, and children participated equally in the early stages of ceramic preparation. The gendered division of craft labor that later became a feature of many ancient societies had not yet hardened in the workshop at Ulukak. What the clay preserved was a more egalitarian picture, a community working together, hands in the same clay, leaving the same involuntary signatures in the same material. There is something almost unbearably intimate about that detail. 8,000 years of human history separates us from the child whose fingerprint pressed into that clay during a morning of workshop preparation in western Turkey. Every civilization that has ever been built, every war ever fought, every religion ever founded, every empire ever raised and fallen, all of it fits between that child's fingerprint and ours. And yet, the ridge pattern survives, specific, unrepeatable, more personal than any name that child might have carried. Now move forward in time by approximately 2,000 years and move geographically into the heart of Anatolia and toward the trading networks that connected it to Mesopotamia, and the fingerprint story becomes something different, something not just intimate, but economically and politically charged in ways that reveal how sophisticated the ancient world had become by 4000 to 3000 BCE. The Uruk period, named after the great city of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, represents one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of human civilization. Between approximately 4000 and 3100 BCE, Uruk grew into what may have been the world's first true city, with a population that some estimates place as high as 40,000 to 50,000 people in its urban core, an almost incomprehensible concentration of human beings for an era when most of the world's population lived in dispersed agricultural villages. The city's administrative complexity generated something the world had never seen before at scale: a bureaucracy, a system for tracking, recording, distributing, and authenticating the movement of goods and labor across an increasingly complex economic landscape. And that bureaucracy ran on clay. Cylinder seals emerged during the late Uruk period, around 3500 to 3100 BCE, and they represent a quantum leap in seal technology. Where stamp seals, the flat impressed variety used at Ulukak and other earlier sites, could only produce a single discrete impression, cylinder seals could be rolled across a clay surface to create a continuous frieze of imagery. The design was carved in intaglio, cut into the surface of a small stone or bone cylinder, so that rolling it across wet clay produced raised imagery rather than incised lines. The resulting impression could be as long as needed, wrapping around a jar, sealing a door, authenticating a tablet, identifying the person responsible for a transaction with the same unmistakable personal specificity that a fingerprint carries today. And the designs on cylinder seals were identity documents as much as they were art. They depicted the owner's world, their profession, their status, their religious affiliations, sometimes their name in the pictographic script that would eventually become cuneiform. A merchant rolling their cylinder seal across a clay tablet was doing what we now do when we scan a biometric and enter a PIN, asserting identity, authorizing a transaction, creating a record that could be verified and that could not be plausibly faked without destroying the very object that carried the authentication. What the fingerprints preserved in clay at Ulukak and sites like it add to this picture is the layer that the formal seal system does not provide. The seals tell you what someone wanted the world to know about them: their status, their affiliation, their authority. The fingerprints tell you something that no one intended to communicate at all. They tell you the biological reality of a specific human body, at a specific moment, doing a specific thing. They bridge the gap between the social identity that ancient people constructed for themselves and the physical reality of the individual who constructed it. Researchers studying ancient fingerprints in clay have noted that the technology for analyzing them has advanced dramatically in the past decade. Modern imaging systems, confocal microscopy, photogrammetry, structured light, scanning can render the ridge patterns in ancient clay at a resolution that allows direct comparison with modern forensic fingerprint standards. If a fingerprint on ancient clay is clear enough and was impressed without the finger moving or double pressing the ridge, patterns can be captured in sufficient detail to allow pattern classification. Whorl, loop, arch, the same categories used in criminal forensics, the same biological individuality that every living human being carries in the skin of their hands. The question of whether ancient fingerprints can be forensically matched to other impressions by the same individual is not yet a matter of routine practice in archaeology, but it is a matter of active research. If the same individual left fingerprints on multiple objects at the same site, on clay loaves, on vessel walls, on seal impressions, on construction materials, it would theoretically be possible to identify a constellation of objects all produced by the same hands. Not a name, not a face, but a biological signature connecting otherwise unrelated artifacts to a single human life. That possibility carries implications that extend beyond archaeology into what might be called the history of individual lives. Most of what we know about the ancient world concerns structures, systems, institutions, and elites. The names that survive from the earliest periods of writing are the names of kings, priests, and merchants important enough to appear in official records. The people who made the pots and pressed the clay and worked the workshops and carried the goods along the trade routes, the vast majority of the people who actually built the ancient world, are nameless in every official record that has survived. Their labor is visible in the archaeological record. Their bodies are not. A fingerprint changes that. Not completely, not in a way that restores a name or a face or a story, but in a way that insists on the individual, that says, this was one person, not a category. This was one specific human being, not the abstraction of a workforce. This person had a body, with hands, with skin, with ridge patterns that were already fully formed when they were born, and that never changed until the day they died. They pressed those hands into clay, and the clay remembered them in a way that nothing else did. The trading networks that those hands were part of were, by the time the seal system had fully matured in the Uruk period and the early Bronze Age, extraordinary in their reach and complexity. Local trade in ancient Mesopotamia began in the Ubaid period around 6500 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the oldest layers at Ulukak, and had developed into long-distance trade by the Uruk period around 4000 BCE. By 3000 BCE, it was flourishing across a geography that connected the Indus Valley to Egypt and every major settlement in between. The goods moving along those routes were not luxury items for the exclusive consumption of elites, though those moved, too. They were the foundational materials of ancient life: grain, clay, reeds, copper, ivory, pearls, semi-precious stones, carnelian beads, gold, silver, timber, the basic inputs that settlements in one ecological zone needed and could only get from settlements in another. At sites like Hakkari in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists have found what they interpret as Uruk period outposts, or colonies, settlements where communities from the southern Mesopotamian alluvium established a commercial presence in a region that controlled access to raw materials they needed. The seal impressions found at these sites, stamp seals and cylinder seals, pressed into clay bullae and clay tablets, represent a documented administrative interface between at least two distinct cultural communities operating according to their own systems, but meeting in the clay of shared commercial practice. The seal impressions on that envelope carry the same information they carried 4,000 years ago: the identity, the authority, the commercial standing of whoever sent the document. And if the clay of the envelope was soft enough when it was impressed, if the sender's hands were in contact with the material during the sealing process, there is a possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility, that a fingerprint survived alongside the formal seal impression, waiting for the right imaging technology to make it visible. That possibility is exactly what makes the current moment in Anatolian archaeology feel like the early stages of something large. The combination of increasingly sensitive imaging tools, dedicated forensic analysis of ancient clay objects, and the sheer volume of archaeological material that sites like Ulukak and Kultepe have produced, and continue to produce, means that the next decade of research is likely to reveal more about the individual lives of ancient people than all of the previous century of excavation combined. In 2025, the 7,500-year-old stone seal discovered at Tadim Fortress and Hoyuk in Elazig in eastern Turkey added another data point to what is clearly a pattern of earlier than expected social complexity in ancient Anatolia. The Neolithic era seal found there was not a simple mark of personal ownership. It was evidence of organized social systems, systems of identity, authentication, and administrative control, operating in communities 7,500 years, ego that the prevailing model of Neolithic social organization had not predicted would be that sophisticated that early. Researchers noted that the seal serves as evidence that ancient Anatolian peoples possessed sophisticated systems of organization, trade, and social identity far earlier than many realize. It is a statement that applies not just to that single seal, but to the entire accumulating body of evidence that Turkish archaeological excavations are producing across a landscape that appears to have been a crucible of human social innovation for millennia before the civilizations we teach in school emerged. The 3,500-year-old Luwian seal discovered at Turkmenkara in southern central Turkey bears a name and a title, both carved in the Bronze Age script of the Luwian language, making it one of the rare instances where a seal directly names the individual who used it. The seal does not belong to a king or a god. It belongs to an official, a person occupying a specific administrative role in the bureaucratic hierarchy of a regional Bronze Age power. The presence of both a personal name and a title on a single seal, and the discovery of seal, impressions from additional officials at the same site, reveals what researchers described as a hierarchy in which different individuals held defined responsibilities. A bureaucracy, an administrative structure, a world in which your identity was your seal, and your seal was pressed into clay, and the clay lasted. The Hittite royal seal, found during excavations in Kırıkkale in 2024, bearing the inscription, "Whoever breaks this will die," is perhaps the most dramatically explicit statement in the entire ancient Near Eastern sealing tradition of what seals were ultimately about: authority. The seal was not just a marker of identity, it was a marker of consequence. The clay was not just a record, it was a threat. Breaking a sealed document without authorization was not merely a commercial violation. It was an act against the order that the seal represented, the order of ownership, of contract, of the social agreements that held the trading world together. That world, built on clay and seal and fingerprint and threat, was the world that a person in ancient Anatolia 6,000 years ago was participating in when they pressed their hands into wet clay and left the marks that we are only now finding. They were not anonymous, they were not primitive, they were operating within a commercial and administrative system of considerable sophistication, using tools of authentication and identity that were functionally equivalent to what we use today: a signature, a biometric, a seal, a password, and doing so because the trading networks they participated in demanded exactly that level of institutional trust. We do not know their name. We do not know their face. We do not know which goods they traded, which routes they traveled, which language they spoke when they negotiated the terms of a transaction that needed to be sealed and authenticated and recorded in clay. We know only that they existed, that their hands were real, that the ridge patterns on their fingertips were as specific and as unrepeatable as any that have ever pressed into any surface in the history of the world. And we know that the clay kept them. Through 6,000 years of burial and pressure and the slow grinding passage of time that erased everything else about them, the clay kept the one thing about them that no document and no monument, and no official record could have preserved: the actual physical fact of their body. The ridges of the skin on the tip of one finger, pressing into wet clay on a day when they had goods to seal and a transaction to complete, and no idea at all that 6,000 years later someone would find what they had left. Archaeology in Turkey is not finished. If anything, it is accelerating. The 765 ongoing excavations that the country had active in 2024, up from 720 the year before, are producing a steady stream of finds that each add a piece to a picture whose full shape we are only beginning to see. Fingerprints in clay at Ulukak, seal tablets that haven't been opened in 4,000 years at Kultepe, a Neolithic seal at Elazig whose existence implies administrative complexity centuries, earlier than the models predicted. A Luwian seal, naming a Bronze Age official who ran a piece of an ancient bureaucracy. A Hittite CL threatening death to anyone who breaks the authentication. All of it made of clay. All of it fired by the heat of the kilns that the workshop at Ulukak tells us were being operated by skilled craftspeople 8,000 years ago. All of it pressed into shape by hands whose fingerprints may still be there, waiting for the right imaging technology, the right angle of light, the right question asked of the right piece of fired clay. The trader who pressed their seal into clay 6,000 years ago and left their fingerprint alongside it did not know they were creating a record of themselves that would outlast everything they ever built. They were closing a transaction. They were authenticating a shipment.